This is Common Sense Generation. Common Sense Generation. We are at the Faculty of Philosophy at Warsaw University, and I invite you to take part in the debate about Roger Scruton's philosophy on the occasion of his 18th birthday, which we are celebrating here. And in the debate takes part Marek from Roger Scruton's Legacy Foundation and Professor Agnieszka Nogal, the head of Faculty of Political Philosophy here in Warsaw. So please join me. I would like to say a few words about Roger Scruton himself. We're probably all fans of him, maybe not all looking at Magda, but definitely we all appreciate him as a philosopher and author. And he, at least for me, was a very inspiring character who, as I first approached his books through Professor Markiewicz, who made it possible here at this very Faculty of Philosophy in Warsaw, I thought, wow, this is a guy who eventually put in words things which were my intuitions. I had those intuitions. I thought something similar, but I couldn't name it the way he was naming things. He was understanding things, looking through. And the other thing what I greatly appreciate about Roger Scruton was the wonderful style of his works, the style of which is light, but it's also very deep. You can just ordinary people who are there outside, not philosophers, can read it and appreciate it, but also people who are philosophers, obviously can read those books. And I do not think it's an easy thing to achieve, to have such style in English, to write in this version instead of, let's say, German tradition of very, very heavy. You don't necessarily need to sound like Kant or Heidegger in order to do philosophy, and he proved this. And the second thing I think he achieved in academia altogether is the fact that he brought back conservatism as a part of academia in university. So not as the fact that you are less educated, that's why you have certain conservative beliefs, but just because you have those beliefs, and this is a statement, like any other statement in the branch of philosophical moves, or so I think this is what we appreciated to him, and also the fact that he, as a conservative philosopher, touched those topics which are not touched usually by a conservative thought, because there were many conservatives as practical thinkers, let's just say Margaret Thatcher or my personal fan, Lee Kuan Yew, but there are not that many philosophers to put them in sort of a system, and Roger Scruton did. In many of his books, he wrote more than 30 books, and most of them are translated in Polish. So we have this wonderful opportunity to read them in Polish. And we'll start today with his philosophy, and just reminding he was born in 1944. On the 27th of February, so let's say tomorrow. Tomorrow he would have 80 years. And what is important is the fact that he was active in many dimensions, and that's why inspiring. And I would say also a very kind person who took under his wings a lot of students, including people here from this faculty. And a person who is not with us is Mikołaj Sławkowski-Rode, who was a fresh young student from Warsaw University and Marxist in those times, and Scruton took him under his wings and allowed him to write his master thesis and later his PhD thesis with his help, under his guidance. But I think the other person who's deeply attached here in Poland with Scruton is Marek Matraszek. Marek, we have you here, and out of all of this crowd, definitely you're a person who knows Roger the longest. Tell us how did you meet, how at this moment, and how he was, well, very young.
Well, it's very kind of you, Maria, to invite me, and I'm actually at a disadvantage because I know that I'm sitting next to a much more capable philosopher than I am. So I'm not certainly going to have no pretense of articulating Roger's philosophy to the depth that I'm sure my colleague will. But thank you for that introduction. And you are correct. I've known Roger for almost 40 years. And actually, that wasn't an interesting slip because he still is with me, and I think he's still with a lot of people. Despite the fact that he passed, 3 years ago, it still seems as though he's still here with us and informs us in every day, because he was a remarkable person and he had that incredible ability to relate to a whole range of people, not just philosophers, but as you rightly say, his students and ordinary people. And well, as to how I met him, it's an anecdote that a lot of people know. I was actually in 1984 at the Catholic University of Lublin. I was a young lector there in the English department. And Roger had been a friend of Kul for many years. He'd been traveling and teaching there for 4 or 5 years beforehand. And I was fortunate enough to be passing along a corridor, and there was an advertisement for a lecture on Kant and Wittgenstein by Roger Scruton. And so I attended it, and afterwards I introduced myself. And the first thing he said to me, and it's actually very enlightening, was, "I'm very nice to meet you. Do you know any anti-communists in this town, in Lublin?" Because actually that was the one thing that he was genuinely interested in, was the disaster that communism had created. So within 2 hours, I had introduced him to some elements of the Lublin anti-communist underground at that point. And that's how it started. And then the reason why Roger was interested in meeting anti-communists in Lublin was not only for philosophical reasons, but because he was actually in the process of developing a network in Poland of dissident groups, which he in turn, together with other people, some of whom you may know actually, one of whom, Agnieszka Nogal, who was the daughter, of course, of Leszek Kołakowski, whose life history is intrinsically linked with the philosophy department of Warsaw University, together with other luminaries such as Denis O'Keefe, Bob Grant, Timothy Garton Ash, were running something called the Jagiellonian Trust, which was purportedly an academic charity, but was actually a front organization for the organization of intellectual, financial, and moral assistance to dissident groups in Central Europe, especially in Poland and Hungary. And so Roger, together with others, over the next 4 to 5 years until the fall of communism, was deeply involved in supporting who even then could be identified as conservative or non-leftist dissident groups within Poland, within the Polish underground at the time. That's another area we can discuss. So that's how I met him, and as I said, it started off with his one question: are there any anti-communists here? And that was something that really drove him in many ways.
One thing, because you studied in Oxford, but in those times you didn't meet him in Oxford itself, but you need to come to Poland in order to meet him, and then sort of take him back, go and find him back, of course, in England. So this element that Roger became very active here in Eastern Europe, so in Poland, Czech Republic, and then of course, because of his books, then became very popular in UK.
Well, yes, you're right. I have to admit, I only studied philosophy for a very short time at Oxford. So, but this was in the 1980s when he was already starting to drift away from mainstream academia in England. As you know, he was initially a doctoral student at Cambridge University of Elizabeth Anscombe, and he was embarking on a very ordinary, well, I say ordinary, but quite illustrious academic career as a philosopher, originally in Cambridge University, but then in Birkbeck College, London. But by the middle 1980s, he was, I think, realizing that intellectual fulfillment would be very difficult for him in British academia. And it was, I think, the feeling was mutual in the sense that because much of British academia was moving in a leftward direction, he was finding it more and more difficult to find an audience. And so he decided that his intellectual work would have to be completed in the public sphere more than the academic sphere through his books. I've only a very small correction. It's about 50 books he's written. I know because I've got them all on my bookshelf at home. So it was over 50 books that he wrote, and he decided that his mission in life was to be much more of a public intellectual, talking not to a narrow coterie of academics on very esoteric philosophical subjects, but reaching as many people as possible, not just through his books, but also through his popular writing, his columns, and his speeches. So he became much more of a public intellectual than an academic one, which made, in that sense, he was more continental than British. Perhaps we might come back to that.
We'll come back to this, but right now we give voice to Professor Nogal, asking, Professor, where actually you met Roger Scruton, because I know you met him personally yourself.
Yeah, I met him a few times. He was a friend, deep friend of Poland and Poles. And for the first time, I met him in 2007. A Polish ombudsman. During that period, it was Janusz Kochanowski, organized a conference on human rights. And Roger Scruton was a major figure at that conference, so it was a possibility. And that conference was a rather small one, so we had time to speak to each other and, to have small talks. So it was a very, very nice opportunity to meet him for the first time. And after then, he was in Poland many times, and it was comparable easy to invite him, and he was open to visit University of Warsaw or any conference with people who were interested in speaking with him. And for the last time I met him in 2019, yes, so before his death. And in Poland it's a little bit difficult to speak about conservatist philosophy because we have no tradition of conservatism. It's difficult because we had never, in our history, we had never a proper monarchy. Never, ever. We had only proper monarchs from abroad during the partition period. So it was not a Polish case, the sides of intellectuals after the French Revolution. It's simply not our tradition because majority of Polish intellectuals, philosophers or literates, literary thinkers were rather closer to the human rights movement, so to the revolutionary part of that discussion. So for me, it was a little bit difficult to meet someone from the British liberal and also conservative tradition, and so that point was a little bit difficult for me because Polish tradition is different, it's republican, and with no many commonly shared ground with the British tradition. But at the same time, there were many aspects of that philosophy which were very interesting for me. And the first point of it was interest in aesthetic, but from the perspective of political philosophy. Maybe Roger Scruton, at least for me, was the first person who put it so precisely that aesthetics is not something which can be perceived only from subjective perspective, yes? That if I wear something, I am visible for others. And if I am constructing a building, that building is visible to the others. It's not something which can be only interpreted as subjective, yes? And yes, and for me it was a starting point of interesting in his thought, and I found his aesthetics very, very interesting, and probably most interesting part of his legacy. And of course, he was also very deeply rooted in British tradition of aesthetics. I mean, especially Edmund Burke notion of aesthetics with the idea of taste at sublimity, yes, things which are sublime. So for me, it was really interesting to be a little bit more involved in that discussion rooted in British history, you know, around the common sense. Here in Poland, we are rooted in tradition surrounding the idea of practical rationality, rather that common sense. We are not using sensual metaphors to describe that type of understanding of commonalities. But nevertheless, the perspective of Roger Scruton was really, really interesting for me. And, you know, probably without him, I would never took, once again, Edmund Burke works on aesthetics. Because I read it during my study times, and, you know, because I was studying aesthetics as a part of curriculum. But because of him, I read those works again, and yes, now I am convinced, and probably convinced by him, that you know, beauty is not something what he or she likes, but beauty is what we really do have in common, because our subjective perspective on taste and things which are sublime, we are sharing those emotions, those taste, and we share it because we are surrounded by a space which is a common space, yes? So for me, it was a starting point, and I will give a voice to Maria.
So I read right now a quote from Roger Scruton about beauty. Beauty matters. It's not just a subjective thing, but a universal need of human beings. If we ignore this need, we find ourselves in a spiritual desert. And Roger Scruton fought for the beauty on many aspects, not only in philosophy and literature, but I would say that his final works were being part of the committee Building Better, Building Beautiful, which were trying to reshape architecture in the United Kingdom and find a way how to create buildings which are useful for public use. So it is, as you know, probably England is very crowded, especially London. So he wanted to find out the way how to build stone houses which can put a lot of people in, but without actually damaging the architecture of beautiful Victorian streets. And this is something which I think, took him unfortunately down, because he tried extremely hard, and then he was faced with a lot of criticism, public criticism, not only in British Parliament, but also from British newspapers, with a lot of very unfair information, which later were put straight, but no one cared as deeply as in this certain moment when the publicity was very bad about Roger Scruton. But I know that his students are still trying to fulfill this last task of building better and building beautiful. Marek, you probably know more about this final act.
Well, before I reply, I think I would actually like to very much follow on to your point, because I think you make a very good initial point about the essence of Roger's view of philosophy, which was very much this distinction between, actually trying to sort of popularize the view that philosophy and thought and aesthetics are a public exercise, and that value is a public construct. And that we perceive the world only because we perceive it in categories which are defined by us through our experiences within the public sphere, through language, and especially through the modality of through culture, and culture being a human product which has developed over a certain passage of time. In other words, the apparatus through which we view the world is not something that we invent ourselves. It's something that we unconsciously, in many cases, inherit from others. And those categories of perceiving the world may be in religious language, they may be through local customs and traditions, they may be through our family traditions. And this informs also this unity of what I thought was a crucial part of Roger's thinking, which was this unity of the moral with the beautiful. And that he would definitely say that our definition of what is beautiful is as much a moral category as it is an aesthetic category, because both are actually functions of us as social beings. So he very much refuted the Cartesian idea that we are somehow these individuals, looking out to the world in an abstract way, but rather we are a product of a community whose values are informed by traditions and values which we inherit. And that in terms of, that also defines our duty towards the world as being one of preservation and inheritance rather than destruction and autonomous creation, which was the fundamental reason why he had this cathartic experience in 1968. Very symbolic year, because obviously 68 was important not only in Western Europe but also in this university. But for Roger, 1968 was his experience of the student revolution in France. He was in Paris at the time of the student revolts, and I think he actually writes about this experience of looking at the rioting students in the Parisian streets and finally having this cathartic moment of understanding that this is something that he rejects. He rejects destruction, and in fact, he thinks that preservation is the mode that one should conduct one's life. My only very short second point, and this is actually an interesting point about Roger's relationship to British philosophy, and certainly in terms of his political philosophy, he would of course look to, and many people today look at him as the third grand figure of conservative political thinking alongside Burke, correctly, and Oakeshott. And Scruton is seen as the third towering figure of British conservative thinking. But actually, as many writers have noticed, his real interest in philosophy was much more continental than it was British. He felt very isolated from the British tradition of analytical philosophy, precisely because, in his view, it skewed philosophical thinking only to that which can be scientifically or logically defined. And he felt that the British analytical tradition separated philosophy from the grand continental perspective, which was really the perspective of Kant, Hegel, Wittgenstein, Husserl, all of whom agreed that the world can be perceived or should be perceived not only through the categories of logic and science and rationality, but it had a dual nature, which was also one whereby it should be perceived and could be perceived through non-analytical categories such as beauty, truth, value, emotion. And that's why he coined this concept of cognitive dualism, which he believed was actually the defining essence of his view of the world, was that we are human precisely because we understand that matters in the world not only have causes, material causes or technical causes, but they also have reasons. There are reasons why things happen, and if they do happen through the act of human agency, they do so because human agency is driven by value and a perception of beauty or human moral choices, which can't be reduced merely to the technical or scientifical. That's why he was such an opponent of neuropsychology and so on, that tries to reduce human emotions merely to the functioning of brain cells and neurons and so on, clicking off each other. So he was actually as much a continental philosopher as he was a British philosopher. And so when just to sort of go back to your question, Maria, about the building better, that actually was driven very much by that vision. As you rightly say, he viewed one of the greatest blights in British architecture as being obviously the blight of modernism, especially from the 1950s and 60s onwards, which viewed architecture as purely a functional, technical form of creation, which bore little relation to either beauty or to the interests or views of those who actually would use those buildings. And he viewed, together with a number of other people, that one of his life's missions was actually to try to restore in some way, and this was into British politics, and it's the boring topic of planning and architectural planning, the view that when buildings are constructed, they should be, first of all, viewed as being in tune with the local community, that there should be some sort of relationship between that building and the buildings around it, that those buildings in turn should be constructed around a sentiment relating to the values of the community that those buildings served. And ultimately, they should be beautiful, that we should have that, because he understood that really great architecture is one where the individual has a direct relationship with that building. It's an interpersonal relationship. We often think when we view a magnificent facade or a building or a church, we enter into an emotional relationship with it. We see it as something of value. We see it as having soul. And we grow to love that building much as we do individuals, which you can't imagine doing to a modernist 1960s block of flats in London. It's something that one has a rejective relationship to. So the building better, building beautiful movement, which he initiated together with other architects and lovers of beauty, was something that was very successful in a way. It was championed by, also supported by Michael Gove, who was the minister at the time. And together they managed to introduce into a small way into British planning law a sense that as buildings, when they are constructed, should have a process of consultation with local communities, so that the final planning and architectural designs should have a true relationship with the people that actually use those buildings, to try to bring humanity back into architecture. He died, unfortunately, midway through this great effort, but it's one I think that's had its continuation in the building better, building beautiful.
Well,
movement.
If this was a problem in UK when it comes to architecture and planning, I'm happy that Roger doesn't go around Warsaw outskirts, especially up where every single building is different.
No, I wouldn't say so, but there are two possible directions. and one connected to modernist thought is trying to build almost the same building everywhere, made of glass and steel. But you know, if you are in the hotel in Dubai, in Warsaw, in Moscow, in London, it looks completely the same, inside and outside. And Roger Scruton's idea was different, and he was very interested.
Excuse me very much. You must be going, but I just like to ask perhaps a silly question. Could you recommend some books of Roger Scruton that I could read to sort of let me know when to start reading, but maybe not all of it?
There is a very tiny, thin book, I think, great to start, and this is Why Culture Matters. Dlaczego kultura jest ważna?
That's what I thought also, and it is in Poland, it's translated.
I'll read it in English. Why Culture Matters.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. And the idea of common space for Scruton was something completely different, and I would name it a kind of ecological attitude toward common space. Yes, because he was interested in local materials and local traditions and their preservations, also in aesthetic terms. So as the result, we have a space which differs in Poland, in London, in Dubai. And it was something really important also for me, yes. He called this, because from one point he was involved as a public intellectual in those debates, sometimes very emotional, and you know, it was one side of his involvement, but the other was theoretical background. Yes, so he took a Burke, he took aesthetic of Kant, but his addition was theory of style. And of course, he was a stylish guy. Yeah, I am happy that you are smiling, because this is the first sentence which describes him. He was stylish. And he was the only one who looked like that, yes? And for him, that individualism, uniqueness, that individualism was really important. And yes, and he had a theory of the style to that rather well-known theories of Burke and Kant. So we have, of course, a commonly shared taste, but at the same time, we like things which are unique because of its historical tradition, because of its even longevity, yes? Even because it is old. And because it is old, it's different than something which can be built now because of techniques and imagination. So for me, that theory of style, which was very, very connected to ecological perspective on localism, local bonds between people, and for him it was not possible to, you know, we are now living in a world in which knowledge is very specified, very diversified, and we look at everything, you know, separately. And for him, it was a commonly shared space of relation, space of being together, space of living at the level of everyday life experience. So he put all of those parts of aesthetics, ecology, ethics also, and politics together.
This is this topic which I also want to underline and ask you about, is the fact that Roger Scruton, in a lot of his books touching different aspects of philosophy, he underlines the fact of common we, of a fact that we don't live as individuals. We cannot talk about a human being in isolation. We need always to talk about a human being in relation with other people, because we don't exist in isolation. And he also said about this element, about very important aspect of us in politics also, which is in his view only in a nation state, because there is no us, we, in the whole country of Europe, and there is no we in only when it comes to when we make this diversion for race or religion. But he said that the main element who creates the common we or identity of a group is nationality, and this is this interesting and very important element. He writes a lot about it and how to be conservative, and the fact the truth of conservatism. But what was for me extremely inspiring as I took this book as a young student was the fact that in this book, How to Be Conservative, he doesn't only show the perspective of conservatism, but he underlines and shows the truth of liberalism, of socialism, of many other aspects, which he shows there is a truth there, and we know why. We cannot just only criticize people who take those positions, because they have a point here and here and here, but it should be sort of a collective thinking. So he had a very broad in mind, and in this case was very tolerant as well, showing this. He didn't isolate himself from other points of view, but he deeply understood them, but also showed errors. Where is the error? So, for example, he showed the errors of the thinking of a revolution, that there are certain points, certain problems in every society, and then we want to create a revolution and jump all together into the paradise, which of course is impossible, but which this sentiment lies under any movement of a revolution, that we will make a huge break, huge change, and then all jump into paradise, which never happened, and usually this paradise ends to be worse than the beginning. But he understood this. He understood why people think like this, and it was, at least for me, very thought-provoking. But coming back to this us, which he shows that is important, and that we have to find common us through the political differences, is this common us in the nation state. Marek, can you develop this a little bit more?
You said it all. There's not much I can add. But you're very right. Roger had this sense that what was the foundation of political society, insofar as there were institutions, was not the Rawlsian or the Lockean view that you could create something or a political institution from an abstract, atomized individuals. That any political system existed primarily because of the pre-political. In other words, that before you had political institutions, in order for those institutions to be long-lasting and to be permanent and to be legitimate, they had to be a sense of a pre-political community, which endowed those institutions with legitimacy precisely because there was this common identity, a common sense of belonging. So whether that pre-political community was religious in character or national in character or local in character, it had to exist prior to any institutions being created that became, in order for any of those institutions to be legitimate. So he definitely had this view that the communal was prior to the institutional. and that institutions could only continue to exist if they were bounded by a common loyalty. Once those common loyalties were disrupted, either through an over-domination of liberal atomism or through the problems that are now starting to exist in many European countries by uncontrolled migration, where you have communities which are actually fundamentally incompatible with each other in terms of their views of the individual, of individual rights, of respect for legal institutions, and that is the cause of ultimate disruption. It's very important to actually make this point, because there is a view that Roger was some sort of right-wing nationalist, which is actually couldn't be further from the truth. He was actually in British terms, he was actually a patriot, but what he actually understood was that cultures have to be understood in their own indigenous terms. He was, in fact, a great scholar of Islam. He spoke Arabic, he could understand, he'd read the Quran, he actually had friends in the Islamic community, and he understood, and he saw, back to one of your other points, some of the values of aspects of Islam in terms of self-restraint, dedication, the concept of purity. These are all things that he felt were valuable, and he was a great admirer, of course, of Islamic architecture and, of course, Islamic philosophical traditions, which he saw as being part of the grand story of civilization, going from Christianity in Greece into through the Middle Ages in Islam, in Islamic philosophy. So, but his view was that these cultures are essentially, almost Huntingdonian in this sense, that they were rival civilizations, but which could only exist stably as long as their core values and principles were understood and shared by the community that existed within them. So he had a very tolerant view, actually, of other nationalities and other religions, but as long as they were in their indigenous homeland, as it were. So that was one way of he was very friendly, actually, to them. And that goes into his other aspect that you touched on, which is his relationship with people that he disagreed with intellectually. He also had a great respect for other scholars, many of whom were not conservatives, but he had a sort of a love-hate relationship with Perry Anderson, for example, who is the father of the New Left, or was the father of the New Left in the United Kingdom. And he felt that one could often have very serious intellectual discussions with other philosophers, other rival philosophers, as long as there was a rooted respect, or a mutual respect for each other, which goes back to his thought that ultimately there is an essence of humanity which brings us together and should be the foundation of a relationship between individuals, no matter how far they disagree with each other. So he was a very tolerant person in that sense, but he was very rigorous in his thinking, and I think those two things are absolutely not in contradiction with each other.
And you mentioned the fact of what is prepolitical, so what exists as free societies, clubs, and everything what he admired, especially in British tradition. And I think we in Poland, and unfortunately due to time of communism, sort of were lack of this part, and we are rebuilding the part of free gatherings, entrepreneurial meetings, and things which cannot be resolved by state. But this I give voice to Professor Nogal.
Let me disagree with you, because you can look at individual, at subject, philosophical subject, as a model which can be applicable everywhere. It's the first perspective. We can find it in Locke or other philosophers, Kant, for instance. But you can look at individual being as a category which is rooted in language and tradition of thinking, and categories rooted in history. And it was his perspective, yes? So he was looking for the let's say, religious source of subjectivity, and that type of relation between our vision of individual, which is deeply rooted in particularity of certain tradition. So, his perspective was at the same time different because of that British context. You know, a British-French discussion about the French Revolution, completely strange for the person, you know, not connected to the Canal La Manche and discussion between Burke and revolutionaries at the other side. But what we had in common when we were speaking about that relations was the tradition of Polish Romanticism. Yes, and for Polish romantics, also individual was perceived as rooted in commonly shared practices. Yes, the language was the first practice, and we are learned. We are not creating our language, but we are learn how to use it properly. So the beginning is learning how it works, and then we can ask questions and conceptualize that problems or questions and tradition. And for me, a kind of equivalent for his vision of civil society was Polish version of civil society. Civil society, which was different, of course, but present. You know, it was during the partition, Poles had uprising almost each 30 years. Yes? Each 30 years, each generation had its own uprising. A little bit crazy, but we can ask how it was possible. And we can, of course, discuss if it was reasonable or anyway. But it was possible because of the existence of the society, civil society, which was invisible for the official governments, foreign governments during that period. So the bonds between people were very, in my opinion, strong, but it was working, of course, differently. But people, and it was also a reason why, in my opinion, Roger Scruton felt so good in Poland, because people knew each other. You know, it was a kind of that type of question. Could you give me some names of anti-communists? Yes, because anti-communists knew each other. They had parties in common. They met. They were acting together. Of course, it was not a type of official public sphere as in Great Britain during the same period, but. Nevertheless, in my opinion, there were such bonds, even if they were acted differently. But to bring that question into our contemporary problems, in my opinion, his vision of civic friendship is really more important even now than it was when he was writing about it, because we are so divided. And you know, those divisions are sometimes so crazy, to be honest, yes? And those divisions are organized around questions which have no practical consequences for our everyday life. And his perspective that we should leave those revolutionary questions, how the best man is looking like, but we should concentrate on concrete questions, very specific, organizing our experience in that concrete environment, for instance, at that concrete street, how it should be organized to make our life a little bit better. Not the best one in the world, but a little bit better than it is now. And for me, it is still appealing, and maybe more appealing now that it was even a few years ago.
I mean, I agree. I mean, I think the view, well, you raised the issue of civil society, and I think this is something where it's very interesting because certainly Roger, we talked about his philosophical influences. So we talked about Kant, and of course it was Hegel who developed the whole initial concept of the civil society, and also, so Roger took that concept, but he also linked it back to Burke and the little platoons of society and so on. And Roger's view of civil society was very much this, as you say, this rooted, genuine, spontaneous, local communities, organizations, clubs. He loved to hunt, of course, so hunts have to come into it. Museums, people who have an affection for the countryside. So he viewed this as the genuine civil society, which he contrasted to what many people today define civil society as being, which is the world of the NGOs, so basically who, essentially activist groups who claim to be or clothe themselves in the language of civil society, but actually in Roger's view have only one aim, which is actually to go out and destroy many of the things which make things valuable and genuinely bonding people together at a local level. The only other comment I would make, of course, is that he was not only a localist, or he wasn't some sort of anarcho-syndicalist or some sort of libertarian in that sense. He actually had a very, very strong sense of the need for national institutions, for state institutions. And whenever you read his more overtly political works, like The Meaning of Conservatism, especially, which is a bit hasn't aged well, to be honest, but that was a book where he really came in talking about the need for national institutions, whether it be the monarchy, the parliament, the legitimacy of the legal system, the institutions of the state as something to be cherished, protected, constructed. And in that sense, slightly against the tradition of Margaret Thatcher and some of the more libertarian strands of the new right that was very prevalent actually in England in the 1980s. He was not a libertarian rightist. He actually believed very much in the importance of state institutions, genuinely legitimate, bounding and protecting these small, or being an umbrella over the stability of small institutions, local traditions, local practices, both mediated through political loyalty. So yeah, but you're right, the civil society thing was something, but it's a very Burkean, Oakeshottian interpretation of what civil society is, rather than the more sort of radical leftist perception of the NGO civil society world.
Yeah, and maybe I would like to add only one point, that for me he was a kind of feminist philosopher. I know that it sounds at least strange, but yes, but he was very interested in not only in production, he was a little bit suspicious about production as a major activity, but preserving, yes, reproductive work in a household, which is a reproductive work, repeatable, without any outside consequences, without producing any goods, external goods to the practices.
Well, except children, of course.
Yes. Okay, but preservation of nature, preservation of environment, preservation of some bonds. Yes, we need time to preserve our bonds within society, and for him it was important. And when we are looking at activities in which majority of women are interested in, of course, it's a kind of sociological description, but it works like that. It's a preservation, not a production, but taking care of. Yes, taking care of people, of bonds, of time and quality of time, of things, sometimes little, yes, and our loved one.
Yeah. Well, on the subject of women, you'd have to be Roger Scruton to be able to be a conservative to write a book entitled Sexual Desire, which I remember very often finding on the top shelf at W.H. Smith's in England because people thought it was some sort of, smutty treatise. But actually, it was one of his interesting books because in Sexual Desire, he actually, you can get it in Polish, it's called Pożądanie seksualne. And if you read it, it's a very interesting book because it actually is a very feminist tract in that sense, because it talks about the distinction between the instrumentalization of sex and the idea that the dignity, the true nature of sexual desire is only achievable if you have a mutual respect and a mutual acknowledgement of the person as the other who you want to possess, but at the same time you want them to maintain their autonomy and dignity. And that's something which, is actually a very pro-women book because it actually lays the philosophical foundation for the rejection of pornography, prostitution, and other sort of things which demean and mercantilize and instrumentalize or objectify women or the other sex. So he was actually, in that sense, he was actually very protective of human dignity, which he saw as a universal claim regardless of sex. So he was actually, in that sense, he was actually a very feminist. And certain aspects of the modern feminist movement who are actually anti-pornographic, anti-abortion, and anti-prostitution is something that he felt he found a common language with.
And just to finish this, probably not all of you know that Roger Scruton wrote also poetry, and I'm in possession of this very small book of poems, Beatitudes, which I was happy to purchase during the Scrutopia, which is also this fabulous summer school, which I had a huge pleasure to attend, and I think I'm trying to repay it somehow by also organizing this event that he was extremely inspiring for me, and I do hope that he remains so for other generations of students. So to read it on, before we pass the voice to you, also everyone who came here for questions, I would like to read one of his, I think, extremely funny but also important poems, which sort of summarize what Marek just said. On decency. It's wrong to see a person peeing. It's far too much at stake. For instance, there's the gift of seeing, which is the reason we are awake. The eyes pop upwards like balloons. Tight below, they strain to watch. The holy icons glow like moons and tuck in hope against the crotch. It is the thread of life which joins our vision to the lower parts. Our hesitations are the coins which purchase love from human hearts. And being realistic, we refrain from saying what we know in order that no stream we see should ever quench the fragile glow, which is the eye's acknowledgement that life itself is not enough, that human hearts were never meant to waste their love on mortal stuff. So this element of transcendent, I think, is very deep in all Roger Scruton books, and I would say what I find in all of them is a certain search for God and search for faith, which he fulfilled in the end in his own local ministry, there serving the community, playing the piano and being the part of the local community there. So right now, well, questions to all of you, because you all are experts, and we're very happy that you showed up. And do you have any questions or any remarks to what was said? George, we'll start with you.
Well, thank you very much, firstly, for this very interesting discussion. Thank you, Marysia. Thank you, Professor. I wanted to recollect one story. I've had the honor of knowing Sir Roger, and I remember, sadly in his later years, I wish I had known him a bit longer, as we all probably, but I started speaking to him about Poland, of course, and I told him these tensions between Poland and Brussels, and Poland is a growing nation, and I was trying to give him the best of my geopolitical understanding of what's going on. And he said, he was very thankful for that, but he said, look, George, this is all very useful, but I'm up to date with everything about Poland. Oh, how come? Do you read some news or about Poland? No, I have this friend, Matraszek, who visits me very often when he's in London, and he keeps me up to date with absolutely everything. So that was really warm to hear, because at that time I already had known Marek, so I knew he's in very good hands. So that's a really nice memory. And he said, also bring me any young aspiring Polish students who would like to learn, who would consider I would have something interesting to say to them, and I did bring a few people to him. So I have great memories. And I have a short question, because the youth today do not read longer blocks of text en masse, and do not read that many books as we know. And yet to understand Roger Scruton, you do need to read a little bit. But in this era of TikTokization of everything, are there ways, or is there any possibility to put some of the wisest or most interesting, intriguing views of Roger Scruton and put them into either short videos or something that would appeal to the younger generations today? And I'm sure Professor is already not smiling, or maybe she's smiling now, because it's sort of bastardization of philosophy when you shorten it. But is there a way to bring Sir Roger to the masses today?
I'm smiling because, TikTokization, it sounds even strange, but maybe that in that period we need critical thinking more than ever. We need to put all of those parts presented in social media together, and we need to read because of it. But probably Maria has more to say about those short, nice and pleasant ways of introducing Scruton.
I would say but George, of course, that TikTok and Instagram and Facebook and YouTube are the current mountain. So if in the Bible Jesus went on the mountain to speak there, we should be there as well. And this is absolutely the goal of Common Sense Generation, and I'm very happy you're going to support it and be a guest on Thursday in this show. And of course, I encourage all of you to watch it, share it, like it, and this conversation is going to be there on YouTube as well. So thank you for asking.
Yeah, very good point. How do you bring Roger into... the lovely thing about Roger's writing is that a lot of it is actually very, very accessible. Some of it is very dense and complex. I certainly wouldn't recommend starting off from the aesthetics of music, because that would, I think, defeat even the greatest of minds as a primer. But certainly, he wrote a number of very accessible books, and actually his, what you might call literary executor, Mark Dooley, who's an Irish philosopher, published a book called Against the Tide very recently, which is a collection of Roger's popular writings in journals, in magazines, and his more journalistic scribblings. It spans 50 years from 1971 to his last column in The Spectator, but they're very short 2 or 3-sided articles, which are the sort of give you the essence of Roger's writing in a very sort of condensed and accessible way. As Marisha knows, I'm also on the board of something called the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation, which I encourage you to Google and look at, because that does have a resource page. And one of the projects that I've been always very keen on is collecting the many speeches and interviews that Roger gave, which are out there on YouTube. But you only have to sort of log in and key in Roger Scruton, you'll get a load of YouTube videos, which for people who can only absorb visually or orally these days, rather than actually read books, is actually one of the easier way of getting into Roger's writing. So I think, here we're very, very fortunate that he left behind him such a copious array of writings that, will last literally, I think, for decades, if not centuries. And allow future generations to access him. And he was lucky enough also to be active during the first phase of YouTube and the television series on beauty, which you can still find on YouTube, I think is a very good way of actually initially understanding his aesthetic philosophy. So there's multiple ways if you know where to look for it, but I agree with you, there is probably a need for it to be more in itself definable and accessible, but it is there, very easily found.
What is also pretty amazing about Roger Scruton, but is even though we look at him very elitarian, because in the core he was, in a sense, liked what we see as an elitarism, or what we. But on the other hand, he was very egalitarian in approach to students and young people, because I don't know any other movement or any other group of philosophers who would specifically search for young people and give them scholarship, give them opportunities to experience something, to learn. And this is, of course, Scrutopia, which is a part of his legacy, where we are invited and able to meet his wife, his children, to see the place. And there are at least 3 people in this room who took part in the Scrutopia, and looking at Bartek behind as well. But I'm very happy that this is an opportunity not only for Polish people, but from people from around Europe. But there is this movement on humane philosophy, which is led by at least 3 of his students and pupils who are also bringing young people together, especially in Croatia, and giving them something to learn, and giving them an opportunity to learn more and have this element of touching the thought, of discussion. And I didn't find any other philosophical movement, during at least my studies, who would give us similar opportunity to young people, and this is at least what I'm very grateful about. Are there any more questions? Behind.
I should like to thank you for the enlightening discussion first, of course, but I should like to return to one point that Professor Nogal especially made, which is the particular predicament of Polish conservatism. And the question would go more or less like this: how does Polish conservatism become the philosophy of establishment? How does it emancipate itself from its historic situation of being an anti-establishment movement, first anti-communist and then anti-post-communist establishment? That's something which I think we need. That's something which was very characteristic of conservatism in England, and of Roger Scruton's conservatism to an extent too.
It's really difficult question, because, for instance, when we are looking at Polish tradition of political thought or political philosophy, we can find. I can show you 2 figures. For instance, Nowski and Piłsudski. Both of them were against conservatism. Yeah, and I wrote my PhD thesis on Henryk Elzenberg, and he was attracted to Piłsudski. So it's really very difficult to speak on a reasonable manner on Polish conservatism, because in my opinion, it was almost no conservatism, at least maybe under the Vienna Habsburg Empire in Krakow, yes, Stańczykowie. But it was no conservatist movement, because conservatist movement is organized around legitimized power, and you know the history. So because of the historical reason, we can only take some threads from Sir Roger Scruton and show them as similar. Yes, such practical rationality idea, such civil society, such perceiving a person as someone who is constructing him or herself in a language which is herited from the former generation. But there were no such a conservatism. Maybe now we can more often call someone conservatist, and it is a little bit similar to British conservatism. But even though our conservatism is different. So I would prefer to speak about those points, those elements, the ism, because ism is rather different than similar, to be honest.
I think one of the confusions is that there's a conflation of conservatism with politics. And actually Roger had very little to write about in terms of political institutions in his books, because he saw conservatism as being essentially a mode of interaction with the human world by the individual person. And that was the definition of him of the conservative problem, was how individuals interacted with the world and how they, whether or they did not perceive the world through the lens of value, which was defined through cultural, religious, or national or communal traditions, which gave them the perceptions and the ability to define the world in categories which were not merely scientific, technical, or functional in nature. And so anybody can be a conservative in either regardless of what political system you're actually existing in, because it's a way of interacting with the world and understanding what is of value and what is not of value in human relationships, also with other people. So it's a mode of existence rather than a political power. And of course, Roger wasn't, he understood that politics was a necessary aspect of human life. And it was an interesting one insofar as politicians did or did not encourage one or other of these modes of existence in their societies. But he was not in the case of England, for example, I'm not even sure whether he was a member of the Conservative Party. And he had a sort of an ambivalent attitude towards the Conservative Party. He liked conservatives because they thought about the world in a similar way that he did, but he didn't like them because they were members of a party. He liked them because they had a certain way of perceiving the world that he felt at home with. So he was actually both apolitical and pre-political, and perhaps even post-political in that sense. But the one thing he was not was a politician. So in that sense, he was not a conservative politician.
Okay, so we take the last question.
I want to ask Mark, yes? Mark.
Yeah, hello.
I want to ask about the idea of prepolitical community or society, community. What is it exactly in Roger Scruton thinking? Is it a kind of pure human nature in metaphysical way, which is essential or metaphysical basic inclination, or something another? This is my first question. And my second question is about the real nature of Roger Scruton's conservatism. Was he conservative because in my opinion we should distinguish between two different and essential each other different kinds of conservatism. The first one is the conservatism which is rather close to culturalism, a kind of culturalism. And the second one, the serious conservatism, is conservatism rooted in metaphysics. Which one of them has represented Roger Scruton? What do you think?
Gosh, that's can I phone a friend? I defer to you, but I would have.
This book, for instance, he represented for me rather metaphysics.
Right. I think his relationship with the metaphysical was very, I think, rather ambivalent. I mean, if you define the metaphysical as the transcendent, then that's something that he had great difficulty in coming to terms with. And it goes into the final point that you made, which was his religious, or his attitude towards religion, which there's some dispute about this. But I tend to the view that he actually, even towards the end of his life, never really came to terms with religion in the classical sense. In other words, he hadn't made, and he actually wrote publicly that he had not been able to make the leap of faith into a belief in God and a transcendent reality above that which exists. I mean, he was a Kantian in that sense, in the sense that he believed that the only real world was the one which one could define scientifically. But also, on the other hand, it was that world which had value. But it was very difficult to actually perceive or understand any metaphysical reality beyond the boundaries of scientific reason. But you know, on the other hand, he precisely talked about culture, and especially music and aesthetic experience, as giving one a sense of a transcendent order, without actually being able to enter it and to understand it and to commune it or to channel it. So he was very humble in that sense, but he didn't deny the idea of a metaphysical reality or a transcendental reality. He just denied that one could actually participate in it and understand it. He said you get a semblance of it through high culture, and especially through the musical, aesthetical experience of musical rapture. He felt this was something that, and that's why he loved music and opera especially so much, and the allegorical aspects that opera brought to aesthetic experience, Wagner and so on. So I think, so to answer your question, I should have actually really deferred to Professor Nogal, but I don't think he came from that metaphysical school of conservatism, so he was not continental, he was not a Hegelian in that sense, but he was much more, I think, if you were to drill down to it, a what you might call a communitarian conservative, if anything, rooted in the real world and defining value from ordinary human experience. And actually, just as a final point, he actually said, this is my role as a philosopher. This is why I'm not a Marxist. I don't intend to change the world. My role is actually to take ordinary, common sense, communal, communitarian sensibilities and instincts and legitimize them. And to legitimize the common sense instincts of the ordinary man and to elevate them into something which is valuable. And that's why actually he left academia and he went to the village and he lived the village life. And he saw his role as being one of a philosopher who actually came back to the people and legitimized their view of the world and gave it dignity and respect. And that was something that I thought is actually more his sense of what conservatism is, rather than any metaphysical musings of Hegelians and so on.
And we could, I think, wrap up with this.
Sorry, but maybe it's different.
Because I'm afraid that the notion of common sense in ordinary meaning of this word is not enough argument in a serious metaphysical discussion.
No, but try to take into account his Britishness. Yes, because he was very concentrated on concrete situation, concrete people. Maybe he was not nominalistic, but at the same time, those well-known people, those well-known architecture, those well-known streets were important for him. So it's a kind of source for his philosophical investigation. So something which is already, he was called it a gift. Yes. So we are coming into the society which is already organized. And he called it pre-political organization because it is an organization not in accordance to theoretical framework, but rather in accordance to concrete problems solved in concrete ways in different societies. And those bonds are primer to the political engagement and political problems, and of course primer to philosophy. And at the same time, he was not a metaphysical thinker. Yes, he used Kant, and when it was comfortable for him. So in aesthetics, for instance, in theory of taste and theory of dignity of the person. But yes, he was very, very concentrated on concreteness.
I think the core here is the rule of subsidiarity. So to resolve the problems at the lowest level without sometimes involving the government in it, but on the lowest part of community. But I think it was sort of already enough of theoretical part. There's another great book which I want to quote to the end, which is of Roger Scruton, which is of course I drink, therefore I am. Wine is not.
Please once again tell the title.
I drink, therefore I am. Wine is not just an object of pleasure, but an object of knowledge, and the pleasure depends on the knowledge. I'm very sure that there's a lot of people are full of knowledge, and that's why let's go to the more pleasure part of celebrating his 18th birthday. Thank you for coming.
This is Common Sense Generation.